When you're done with the planning stage and you feel like you are ready to move on, we can move into the blockout phase. I start a blockout by doing what I call a texture blockout before I even do the 3D model. This might be a different approach from when you are doing other types of 3D meshes, where you start by doing your high poly, for example, and then you do the low poly, and only then do you do the bakes and the textures. Here, I actually start from the texture because I feel that is how I can better understand and find what can be solved on the texture side or needs to be solved on the mesh side of things. It is important to do it in a way that feels comfortable for you to understand your needs, and I feel that to me, starting on the texture is a great way to do it. So I usually jump into Photoshop and I just start drawing based on the stuff I learned previously, and in this step, the most important thing is to make sure that your decisions made now will work later on. Of course, there should be a lot of experimentation and iteration at this step. A lot of back and forth might happen between the texture blockout and the 3D model blockout. This is even more common when you are starting to do vegetation or when you are doing completely new species to you. But if you start getting experienced, this will become less of a back and forth process and it will become more of a single step process. But that's fine either way. The really main thing here is to make sure you are solving all the problems to avoid lose time later on. For these reasons that I just meant, it is important to keep the process very quick and easy, something that is easy to iterate on. So ideally, you want to use something like Photoshop or Affinity Photo or GIMP, whatever you feel comfortable with, to just draw simple shapes and then try those shapes on your model. Remember to keep things simple and don't add too much detail right now. Don't lose so much time adding details and keep it to simple blocks of shapes and colors. The idea is to focus on those main shapes and building blocks that you know will play a big role in making this asset's personality as it is. You know that there are some main key features that give character to your asset, right? So you really want to focus on those and make sure they exist on the texture so that then you can apply them to your 3D model. As mentioned before, besides focusing on that, make sure you are problem solving here, that you are understanding what works on the texture and what works on the mesh. This is the perfect stage for that, and take into consideration the things you learned previously, because that will really give you a lot of clues of what's important and what isn't, and what can be solved by just adding a simple texture or adding a more complex 3D model to it. Some tips that can help you make this process quicker is using resources that can speed up your workflow. If you are used to drawing a lot, for example, it will be great because you will feel right at home and you'll be outputting things quite faster. But if you're not, you can just use things like photo sources, brushes, scans, or whatever works for you to make this painting work faster. Now that we have a blockout of our texture, let's go into SpeedTree to start doing a blockout of the mesh. Before we actually move forward with creating the first mesh, let's go over some things about SpeedTree just so you get used to some stuff here. The first one is that you want to change the background color, because I just don't feel like having this huge line here and this very light blue is helpful at all. So let's go into the Windows properties and change the background from the ambient light style to solid color, and you get this dark blue background. You can actually change the color here if you want, but I actually like this color as I feel it is a nice neutral value. Then let's take a look again in the Windows properties and let's take a look into the layout. This is something that's quite helpful to keep checking different angles of your asset. So in this case, we can have 4 windows. We can have 2 windows, one under and one over, or we can have 2 windows but side by side. And we have of course the default of just having one. And the other thing about this is you have the middle mouse button as a shortcut. If you double click with the middle mouse button on one of the windows, it will actually open that window for you. So this is useful to quickly change between them. This essentially just changes back and forth between the 2 last layouts you were using. So if you have the 2 like this, it will go back to what you had before. So for us, I think it will be more useful to just use the 4 views, because this way you can check the silhouette, which is quite important in all of them. Besides that, you can change the views here as well, where it says perspective, or you can change it to XYZ plane or XY plane. XZ plane and YZ plane. You can actually change them if you want. And now we can take a look at the render modes here. So if you go into the menu up top here again, and you go into the render button, you can actually change the views to a lot of them, which can be useful for debugging stuff or checking, for example, the silhouette, your colors, and stuff like that. We'll make use of them later on. Besides that, we have the show button, which is a place where you can toggle or untoggle stuff. So you can, for example, turn off the leaves only, the fronds only, the branches, and so on and so on. This is great, for example, if you're trying to check your tree branches. You can just go in, turn off all the leaves, and this will help you check the branches without having to worry about anything that's in front of them or the other way around. So this can be useful further down the line. There is also this thing you can do, and you might find this tool when you're searching around SpeedTree, but I actually don't advise you to use it, which is convert the scene units. So SpeedTree works by default in inches, and you might want to change that into the metric system because you're more used to it, as I am, but this will actually create some problems down the line because the values you have on the nodes usually reflect the values in inches and not in meters. So the only thing that will change is actually the height indicator. You will also have to take into account when you are exporting stuff, so I will really advise you not to touch on that. If you need to actually know the size of something, for example, just do a quick Google conversion from inches or feet to meters, and that's probably safer to work that way. Now that we've learned a little bit more about the main functionalities of SpeedTree, let's start creating content for our tree. We need to start by creating some materials. Let's give them some names, which in my case will be the name of the species and a tag at the end. This one will be Atlas, this one will be Bark, and this one will be Reference. So on the Atlas one, we want to make it two-sided, and we want to assign some textures to it. For that, I'll just drag and drop the albedo texture into the first color slot, and I can also import the texture by clicking here, and it will open a window. You can also use the native dialog, which is essentially the Windows Explorer. Just select the image and click Open. Then I need to select the alpha channel because that's where I have my opacity mask placed in the albedo. So the first material is set. Now let's move into the second one, and let's just assign it a color so that we can easily visualize what we are doing to our tree when we are working with the reference behind it. Now let's go into the reference material, let's make it two-sided as well, and let's assign the texture to it. I have a silhouette that I did by grabbing a photo, removing the background, and then adding some extra trunk in Photoshop. The reason why I did that is this was a picture where the tree was actually cut in half, so I just measured it against other ones and I figured how much it was missing on the trunk, so it should be roughly correct. Now the next step will be essentially adding this reference picture to the scene, and to do that we need to add a leaf mesh. Let's assign a material to it so that it has the correct proportions. It's not the Atlas one, but rather the reference. Now let's align it to make sure it is pointing towards the z-axis. Let's also make the boundaries 0 and 0 to make sure it is in the center of the world. And now let's make this way bigger, because I know these trees will be roughly 20 to 30 meters tall, and I know that the scene is in feet. So I need to essentially make it a size that will be the same as it would be in meters, and that's roughly 80 or 80 something feet. I'll make it 84 for now, because I have some empty space up top, which I need to count for. So even though it says 93 here, it's not perfectly aligned as you can see. For some reason it's counting from the top, so I feel like this should be roughly correct. And now we need to adjust it on the scene. To do that, let's also turn off the flip and the fix winding on the skin. And now let's go into the nodes mode, which is a mode that allows you to manually edit things. And let's click the W key to have the move tool. You also have the rotate and scale tools if you want. Let's move it a bit backwards, and now let's go again into this view and make sure that the reference tree is roughly in the center of the world. With that done, the next step before we can start creating stuff is making our base leaf card that we will need for the blockout phase. It should only be 3 meshes for now, so let's call this one branch big 01. I'll copy that name and then let's go with branch big 02, and for the third one let's go with cluster 01. Now let's go into the edit mesh, which opens the cutout window editor, and this is where you can create your leaf meshes inside of SpeedTree. You don't need to import them, you can actually do it here if you want, and my main guideline or rule of thumb is I usually do it inside here if I need to use the anchor points or if it is something more simple. Then you just start placing and moving the vertices around by selecting in an empty space to add one, as you can see, and then click and drag on them if you want to move them. And I'll just adjust them here. I don't want to leave too much empty space to avoid overdraw, which can be expensive. Alright. I think this should be good. And you can also adjust the angle of your pivot point here. And then assign it to the first slot, which will be the LOD 0, even though for now you don't need to worry about LODs. Now let's go into the second one and let's do exactly the same. Adjust the angle and let's add the same amount of vertices, because even though it is a bit smaller, I feel like that's a good enough number, because lower than that it will start to give me some weird bends, for example. And I believe we will be able to afford these two ones, but if we don't and we really need to cut down on the poly count later on, we can just come here and, for example, add one in the middle and delete those two. So you can always iterate on that, no worries about it. This is the beauty of SpeedTree, everything is super modular and very easy to change. So this one is done as well. Now let's go into the last one, which is a cluster. I'll click reset because I find it easier to just start from scratch. Let's add 4 points on the outside like this. And then let's add a 5th one in the middle so that we can push these vertices down and these ones upwards. And this will give us 2 different angles for a single mesh, only by having an extra vertex in the middle. You will essentially have the front view like this, but if you look at it from the side, it will be a cone, and so that cone will give you a second angle, essentially. So you're getting a 2-for-1 kind of deal, which is great. And I think we are set to actually start working on the tree itself on the next step. We want to start creating the tree itself by going from the bigger shapes to the smaller ones. And for that, I will of course start by the trunk. So let's add a trunk tube. The reason why I use this one and not just the basic trunk is, as you can see, this one just brings a lot of stuff set up already, and I don't like that. I want a clean slate. So let's delete it and let's go back into the trunk tube. Now we need to check for some stuff here. Making sure that it's not outside of the center of the world. It usually isn't, so let's keep it as it is. But before moving on, let's also do a sync value. The reason why I add these in the beginning is if you forget and you do a lot of stuff in your tree and later on you find out that it is floating a little bit on the sides when you place it on the terrain, if you then sync it later, you might be affecting stuff that you took some time to build. For example, some roots that were above the terrain and now they will be all under and stuff like that. So you want to do a little bit already, and I think the value of 1 here is usually enough. So next we want to go into the materials tab and assign our bark texture so that this way we can have a better contrast between the trunk and the reference, and then let's actually start doing some stuff. So I want to make it bigger, of course. I don't need it to go right to the top. Let's give it some add room, because later on I will be adding a mesh that will extend this one and that will make it the size I need. So for now, let's give it the headroom it needs. For the angle, 0.5 is fine. You don't need to change that, otherwise it will tilt the tree to the sides. And I don't think there is much we need to do right now around here, besides adding some noise. And this noise is good to add some breakup and have a more natural look to the trunk. Let's also change the size of the noise a little bit. Something like this. As you can see, it won't match the reference one-to-one, which is fine, but it will help you see the scale and the main shapes at least. Now we can move into the skin and just start trying some values. So I know the reference has a thick trunk, but I know that from the other references that I have, that pine trees are actually quite thin, or at least the ones I'm trying to achieve. And even though it looks very off at the moment, I know that this is the value that I want to go for now, a little bit thinner, and later on, if I need to change it, I can do it very easily. I don't want it to be linear here because I want it to be a bit more uniform. That's something you can notice about pine trees, or at least this specific species, is that they are very uniform from the bottom to the top when it comes to the radius of the trunk. And then I think there is not much else to do here. So besides doing this, you can also play with the randomize of these nodes sometimes, if you want to better match it with the back reference, for example. So here you see this one aligns almost perfectly. So maybe just tweak it a little bit, something that works better for your tree. You could come here, for example, and change some settings on the curves of the noise. Maybe apply a bit more on the top only, or apply it a little bit towards the bottom. Just play with your curves, because they are quite powerful when it comes to adding that natural look you will need. So keep that in mind. And when you're happy with your trunk, we can actually move forward and go into adding what will be the mid-sized details, which is the branches. Before we do that, I want to actually change the name of the trunk, just to trunk. And the reason why I do this is to help keep things organized. Doing so from the start will actually help you later on when you're using some curves and some settings in SpeedTree, so keep that in mind. Now we can start by adding the branches, and again, the reason why I'm using these ones is the fact that they are cleaner with less things going on, so we can have a clean slate to work from. I want to change these to proportional steps, as I feel this one gives me a bit more control. I want to move it forward a bit, actually not forward, but upwards. Let's make these maybe 3, and around let's make it maybe 5. For the offset, let's add a little bit as well, just to make it more natural. And a roll that will help you break this balanced look. Alright. Okay. I missed this number. It's 5, not 4. For this one, 7. Let's make this one go a bit lower, just so we have headroom for the next one, which will be a separate node actually. Some rotation, and let's turn off the align here. Okay. Let's now move into the spine. Let's make this 0 and let's go with some absolute values here. Let's also add some randomization here. So you will start getting used to the values if you're using SpeedTree. I kind of already know what some of them do and don't, like how much I can push things and so on. So you might see me use some very specific or absolute values, but that is essentially the main reason. Let's make the branches a bit smaller towards the top. And let's make them point a little bit upwards. Let's make the ones towards the top point a bit more upwards than the other ones towards the bottom. Alright, and let's also add some random values here. Now let's add some gravity to the whole branch and not just the tips. Gravity is very strong here, so just be careful with the values. Also add some randomization, and let's make it a bit weaker towards the top. Okay. Let's also add some noise again, but let's make it a bit more smooth so that we don't have some harsh edges. Speaking of edges, let's actually make the segments go a bit lower because the poly count was really crazy for a low poly. So let's make this one 0 and make them 4-sided cylinders. And let's leave these values as they are right now because later we can come back and adjust them as needed. And of course, let's mess with the radius of the branches as well. I think 0.6 works for now. Let's add some randomization and let's also make them less linear. Alright. Besides that, I don't think in the skin there is a lot more that we want to do. Just double checking here. I don't think there are any options that we want to mess with right now. Okay. So next we want to do something that we talked about previously when we were analyzing things. And that is doing this slight bend downwards, which we already did. But then we want the tips to face a bit upward. We can do that by using a force, in this case a magnet. So let's move the magnet towards the top, maybe a bit more towards the top. And then let's make sure it is roughly in the center of the trunk. Now let's go back and check where it is affecting things. In this case, it is affecting the branches which we want. Let's make it a bit weaker. And then let's also make it less obvious towards the bottom. And let's change how it affects the branches themselves with the curves. So essentially these curves are in relation to the parent. So for example here, what you are saying is that you want the magnet to affect less the things that are towards the bottom of the trunk and affect more or affect 100% of the value you are using here towards the top. The second curve is in relation to the mesh itself. So in this case, it is the bottom of the branch and the top of the branch here. And you can do a lot of cool stuff by just using these curves, so just really take advantage of them. As you can see, the branches already have that look where they go downwards and then they start pointing upwards a little bit more, so that's good and it is getting in the direction that we want. And as you can see, I'm not pushing the branches too much outwards because I will have some meshes in the tips of the branches later, the leaf cards, that will fill this space. Also, let's make sure the tree silhouette is more uniform than the reference. That's because this is a tree you will be using in a forest, for example, and you don't want it to pop out too much. So you don't want your tree to be too unique. You want it to be a good looking tree, but you also need to make sure it is rather uniform and that it doesn't stand out too much. Because if you do it in a very unbalanced way, it will be very noticeable when you are placing it on your level, if you have 100 of them, for example, and you will see the repeating patterns quite often. I think for now we are good with this one. So let's just change the names to branches mid. Let's do a copy of these nodes, Ctrl C and Ctrl V, and then plug it again into the trunk, and then let's call it branches top. Now for these ones, what we want to do is actually unplug the magnet for now, and then move them upwards. We want to make sure that the first value is higher than the last value of the mid ones. So something like this should work. And then let's move these ones upwards as well, but let's not make them go really towards the top. Now let's extend the parent, as I mentioned before. You can see that I'm extending the base trunk. And maybe let's have less of them vertically and also less of them around, because it is a smaller area, so the branch cards themselves will already fill a lot of this area. Let's make the offset lower, and let's also do the roll lower and check from the top. So maybe we want a little bit. Let's hide these ones. Just trying to get it right. Or let's actually try something else, which is turn on the align. Okay, so this helps in this case. Turn the other ones back on again. Maybe this helps as well. Okay, so it is quite uneven, which is good. And I think this is going in the right direction. So let's go to the side view now, and let's update things here. So one of them will be making the size lower, and you want to make a size similar to what you have as a lower value here, because this way you are connecting the size of these ones here with the ones above them. So make it something like 8, and let's change the random scale as well, because they are smaller, so you don't actually want them to be affected as much or be as random. And we also want to keep the size a bit more consistent. We want them to be more aggressive with the angle, so let's make them point a bit more upwards. Let's move the random value here, and let's make the gravity lower. And let's maybe make the noise bigger. Then randomize it a bit. Now let's turn on the magnet again. And let's make it linear growth. Let's make it max here. I think something like this will already help me achieve what I need, and later, if I want to, I can come here and of course change things until I get exactly the look I'm looking for. I think that for now this should be all good, but we need to fix the radius of our branches. So because the trunk is a bit thinner towards the top, the branches suffer from it as well, so let's add a bit more radius to them. Maybe 0.7 will work better. And something like this works, but let's also update it here. Let's take a look at it from different angles. And then something we also want to do is, because this one feels to me a bit too poking out, let's grab this node, go into the nodes editor mode, which is the manual mode of SpeedTree, and in this mode you can actually go in and edit every single one independently. This is quite good because you can work with the procedural approach while still keeping all of the manual control. So let's make it a bit lower, and I think this works. After you have your branches done and you are happy with them, the next step will be starting with the leaf cards. So for that, we will start by the middle ones. So let's go into this view so that we can get a better sense of scale. And let's add a leaf mesh. So here we will go maybe with something more like phyllotaxy, and let's do alternating. Let's keep it aligned for now, and then let's make it lower. And let's add some randomization with the spread. Let's also make sure they don't grow from the bottom of the branches. So let's make them 0.4 here. Okay. And also let's add some randomization so that every branch is a little bit different. Another thing I want to do is in relation to the trunk, I want the leaves to grow more towards the base of the branches on the top of the trunk, but on the bottom, I want them to grow more towards the tips of the branches. So it is essentially what you see on the back reference, where the branches below have only leaf cards, or what would be leaf cards, towards the tips, while these ones actually feel more of the center. This actually adds an interesting look to the tree because it adds some variety and almost a kind of gradient from the bottom to the top. Let's also make this one go a bit backwards, and let's also make it grow on the tips of the branches. So for now this seems to be good, but we need to see what we are doing, right? So let's add the actual leaf cards. For that we want to add both of them. Even though they have different scales, I want them to be both here so that I have some variety. Now let's make the leaves a bit bigger, and I will use the actual size option. What this does is it will scale things in relation to their original size. It doesn't matter if it's imported or if it is made out of the cutout meshes. The only difference is if it is an imported mesh, it will essentially scale it based on the scale that SPID resets it, which is usually uniform in every file in relation to their size in the texture atlas. But if you have an imported mesh, it will take its original size into account. If you turn it off, the value will be absolute, which is wrong if you have details of different scales on your atlas, because if you have this mesh, for example, but you also have this cluster 1, they will both be the same size, so you can see how that could be wrong. Now let's make it a bit bigger, maybe even a little bit more. Let's try 6. Let's add a bit of variation. Let's make them a bit smaller towards the tips of the branches. And leave these two on. Let's fold the leaf cards so that we have a bit more angles going on. Let's add some bigger random value here. Doesn't really matter, we just want some variation. Let's also add a bit of a curl and then also add some variation to that. Okay, I think that's good. And now let's go into the orientation. So here what we want to do is make the leaves point forward. Okay, and let's go with 0.5. But we actually want the ones towards the base of the branches to be more on a 90-degree angle. Let's also do a bit of a tilt here, maybe 0.1, then add some random variation, something like 0.2. And these ones are already set up, so let's leave it like this. And I think we are getting somewhere, but we might want to do something else, which is here in the rotation, add a random value. And let's check the tree in color mode. So we're getting somewhere already. But now let's push this a bit further. To do this, we will be using the anchor points. So let's go into the cutout editor and let's start adding some anchor points. We will add the first ones with ID 1, and these ones will be used for the front-facing leaf cards with the cluster. And then, after those are placed, we will also add one with a second ID, and that one will be used to extend these branches, but only sometimes. Let's do the same for this one. My bad, I clicked outside the cutout window by mistake. So let's add another one here maybe, and the other one here with ID 2. And I don't think we need more for now. Just double checking it. And I think I'm missing one. So let me add it again and assign it to the lot 0 slot again. Now that we have that, we can actually start by adding new leaf card meshes. And what we will do for these ones is make sure they only grow on the second anchor point. Let's make this value a bit bigger. Not sure if it's affecting it. Okay, let's leave it at 0 by now. And again, let's change the size of the cards and make it the same size as the others, of course. Okay, let's also add some random value here. This is the wrong channel. It needs to be in relation to the branch's mid. So if you remember, I mentioned that having things organized helps, and here is an example. Now let's assign the material. Let's only add the second one because it's smaller. So this way we avoid having two big branches. Let's also add some of the same values. So it will be 0.35 here. Actually, for this one, let's do a bit less. I don't think we want to fold them because that will look a bit more artificial. This is because if they have a value and then you add more on top of that, it can start to look too curly. So this way we make sure that it only goes up to 0.15. And for now, we don't need to do anything else there, but we want to go into the orientation tab and let's add some random values here as well. So maybe 0.2 for this one. You don't want to go too crazy or it will start to be very noisy and random and not following a pattern. And as we spoke about previously, you want your tree to follow patterns and have a structure. So let's make 0.1 for this one. Maybe I don't want to exaggerate it. And in this one, you can actually go a bit crazy because it only rotates around this axis, as you can see. So let's go with a value of 2. And I think for now, this will be enough and we will keep iterating on it if needed. Let's just go back into the generation tab and let's make sure that they only show up sometimes. To do that, we can essentially, again, in relation to the branch's mid node, make it linear growth. And let's also move this one a bit downwards. And you see what happens is you will only have those extended branches towards the tips of the bigger main branches. Let me just show you the difference. Okay, it was not updating because I had the underlying mesh hidden. This is a common speed tree bug. But you can see how it affects the amount of cards that spawn. Let's just rename the leaf cards before we move forward. Let's do leaf cards level 01. And this one will be level 02. And now for the next step, we will add the clusters. So let's add another leaf mesh. And for this one, we want to make the generation on the anchor ID 1. I want to copy the size. This one needs to be on the second level. Let's make them 6. And again, let's assign the material. And what we want to do now is align them in a 90-degree angle in relation to their parent. So to better see what we are doing, let's go into this render mode and see what's going on here. So it starts at 0, which is like this, and then we want them to be aligned like that. But let's add some variation. Let's also add some variation to this one. And for this one, we can actually leave it at 0. Let's do some deformation here so that we get that two-angle thing that I mentioned, where the back vertex is being pushed downwards or the other four are being pushed upwards. And this way you get the front-facing cards here, but you also get them from the side. Okay, I think that's good. For the next step, we want to do the same we did for the mid branches, but now for the top ones. To save us some time, we can just copy over the two nodes. But before that, let's rename these ones to clusters. And let's copy only those two. And let's assign them here. Now we want something a bit different there. So let's hide the reference for now. Just use the references you have on your reference board and try to achieve something that you like. So let's go with 3 for now, and let's make this one 4 to make it a bit more full. Let's also add some randomization with the spread, something like 0.7 sounds good. And now let's change the placement a little bit. And also change the curve here as well. Now let's make it a bit lower. And let's do something interesting, which is make the big cards only show up towards the bottom of the branches. And the smaller ones only show up towards the top of the branches. So basically they have inverted curves. We can keep the scale as it is, but let's remove some of the folding we did as well. Maybe let's randomize the curl a little bit. And let's do a tiny bit of vertex displacement or noise. And as for orientation, we can rotate it a little bit. Something around 0.1 here. Just see what works for you. Add some randomization. And let's make it point a bit more upwards. So maybe 0.6. Now let's see about this one. And I think this works well like this. You start to get that dense feeling. Let's add a bit more randomization as well. And I think that this works for now. Let's just see with everything on. You see that we already start to have a more natural looking tree. You might want to crank up some stuff and do some adjustments, maybe randomize things a bit here, for example. And let's check our silhouette. And it is getting to a place where I really start to like the look of it. So we do have some interesting negative space, as you can see. And we do have some branches poking out, but we also have a dense canopy, which is kind of what I'm aiming for this specific tree. And then in my mind, what I want to do is have other variations where I can have, for example, the broken branches towards the bottom here to replace some of the canopy. So you can just test it all and approach it how you prefer. And I think we can also do a small thing that will help us visualize things a bit better, which is making the bark material closer to the branch cards. Okay, I think that's good. Now that we finished the top part of the tree, we can move into the next step, and that will be essentially detailing a bit more the lower part of the trunk. The reason why I think this is quite important is that this is the area closer to the player, yet it feels very empty and boring right now. So you can add details depending on your tree. Some trees don't have branches in that area, but they will have things like knots, holes, or differences in the bark, and other stuff like that. This is not the case for this type of tree, but they do have a lot of broken branches, and that's what we will be creating. So for that, we will be using a different approach. Instead of doing it in the cutout editor, which I don't feel will be enough, having just the 2D mesh cards, I am actually going to use a 3D mesh, and that 3D mesh will be using the trim sheet approach that we created on our texture. So essentially, instead of using the cutout editor, you can import custom meshes, either FBX or OBJ files, for example, and you can import whatever you need really. So this is my mesh, and I will show you how it looks in Blender. As you can see, this is just a cylinder with some edges here because I want them to be able to bend a little bit. And I have the UVs sitting with the front edge roughly around the trim sheet. So using the alpha here, we will get more detail than we could ever do with geometry, or at least to the same amount of quality. Because to have very tiny broken details, we will spend a lot of geometry on that. So using a texture, you can save by just having a very simple mesh and still convey that detail. And this small square here, which might actually need to be scaled up later on, is for the cap mesh, so that you don't see inside the branches. And then this is the same idea, but for a smaller one. This one has less edge rings because it doesn't need to bend, it just needs to sit on the trunk. And let's go back into Speed Tree to start placing them. So to spawn them, we will use a different approach, and for that we will need some branch tubes again. Let's go into the Generation tab and choose Proportional Steps, and let's try something like this. Let's make the last boundary a bit lower than the main branches. And let's also push the bottom one a bit higher, because I don't want the big ones to go all the way towards the bottom. I want them to be a bit more on the top part, and then the smaller ones will go from the bottom to the top. Because if you look at these kind of trees, that's actually another kind of gradient you see on them, where you have broken branches here, but they are smaller, and then they tend to get bigger the closer they are to the top, until they get to the main ones. And let's also add some offset, which is always nice to break it up. And let's do a bit of a random value for the roll. And let's crank up this number a little bit. So let's go with 3. Maybe let's also do a very high number on the random here. You see how they feel a bit more natural like this. And then let's sync them a little bit into the trunk to avoid any possible problems. The next thing we want to do is actually go into the Skin tab, choose Spine only, and this way we don't have geometry and we can keep it visible. Let's change the length, but they are not updating for some reason, so let's go again into polygon mode and move it back to Spine only again. Okay, this was actually my fault, I was messing with the wrong value, so let's make these ones smaller and go back on the Skin tab. Let's do something else, which is enable the welding. So what this does is the meshes, instead of spawning from the center of the trunk, they will actually attach to the trunk geometry. And that's mainly why we did the sync value before. And let's keep the failed ones. So when they fail welding, they usually just get deleted, but we want to keep them because we are using a custom mesh, so it doesn't matter if they weld correctly or not. In this case, we just need the welding to make them grow outside of the trunk. Then let's go into the spine and make it a tiny bit bigger. Something like this. Let's add some random scale here and let's make them a bit smaller towards the bottom to help with the gradient I mentioned before. The angle can be 0.5, but let's add some randomness to it, and let's also do some noise, maybe something like 0.7, but let's make it very smooth. And let's make the noise scale bigger. You see, this way you get a bit of the waviness going on, but it's very tiny because these broken branches are actually quite straight in general, but having this variation to them helps. And now let's go and add a front mesh. But before that, we need to do something else that I forgot, which is assign those meshes to the material. So now that they are assigned in the material, let's go back into the fronts. Let's add the material and the meshes. So these would be broken big number 1, number 2, and number 3. And let's make sure the gravity is set to 0 here. Let's add some more random variation to these by adding a value of 0.1 into the boundary hand. And you see we already have some interesting looking branches here. And you can see that the alpha is doing its work. You can, for example, make them thicker here, or you could do it, for example, inside of Blender and then re-export. But it is, of course, nice to have the ability to do it inside SpeedTree directly. This is probably too much. Let's try something like 1.1. Do some randomization until you get some nice placement. Okay. Now we need to do the same thing, but this time let's do it for the smaller branches. So what we'll change here is, of course, the meshes assigned to the material list. So let's go with the smaller ones. And as you can see, they are quite wrong now because the front scale is based on the size of their spine, which was scaled for the big ones. So we need to fix that. Let's do something like this. Let's also make the random scale lower. And for these ones, we don't need to worry about making them smaller towards the bottom. Let's randomize it a bit so that they get the different placement from the bigger ones. And we also want them to spawn in a bigger area. We want them to go from the bottom until the top here. So let's change that to something more like this. And then let's make them go a bit higher as well. Let's add an extra step here. And let's crank this up to be double. And I think we can keep the roll at 3. And let's keep the offset as well. Do some randomization until you get some nice placement. As you can see, we already have a lot of variation going on. Now, the idea is that you go in and you start playing with the values and you just have a day at it. Really work on those shapes and getting exactly the tree you want or need. Maybe even add some extra forces and have them affect the tree in different ways. Do some randomizations, for example, randomize the trunk. Then go in and randomize the branches until you get something you like. And when you are happy, you can go in and do specific edits to the tree using the nodes mode. The only thing you need to worry about is that you should only do the manual edit mode once you are certain that you won't use the randomize button again in that generator node. So only do it if you feel 100% confident that you won't be changing the tree again. And that is because once you do the manual edit mode and then you randomize it, you will lose that manual edit you did, which means you might have to redo work. If you actually try to randomize after you did some manual work, it will give you a message warning that you will lose some of the work. This is looking good, so let's move on. Now that we are closer to finishing our blockout, I spent some time iterating a bit on what I had previously to make sure I am completely happy with the asset. So let's take a look at what I changed and updated, and let's talk about what's important to focus on this stage. Essentially, I went back into my texture, I did some quick and small changes, and I reworked it a little bit to fix some stuff and add some new ones. If you feel you should do the same, then this is exactly the stage where you want to do it and have a lot of iteration on your process, making sure you are solving all your problems both on the texture and on the geometry side. You want to focus mostly on the silhouette and the main shapes, because that is what will sell your asset. The smaller details will just make it go from those 80% looking good to being completely finished and looking great. This is the stage where you want to translate what you learned on the reference analysis, so bring all that information and references you have and compare everything. Try to find what is working for your tree and what isn't, and work on it until you hit that visual standard that you are happy with. Only then should you move forward. This is actually the best way to avoid losing time in the later stages. Now on my hand, what I did was essentially add some stuff to my texture, and we can take a look at that. So essentially I added these broken branches in the bottom. They were not here even though I mentioned them in the planning, but I will essentially be using them for some extra details. Even though they are not the main shapes, they are quite important for the silhouette in the mid distance, and you will see what I mean in a second. I also changed the pine needles. I made them a bit thicker, and of course because of that the shapes ended up changing a little bit, but that's not important right now because when we do the high poly it will probably change a little bit more again. Essentially I made them a bit thicker because it fills more gaps. This way it creates a more lush feeling in the canopy, and it also reduces the chances of problems with anti-aliasing later on. In general, it was just about rearranging some things in the atlas and adding a bit more detail to the other ones. Since I had some empty space to spare, I also made this square a bit bigger so that I can have a bit more variety on the tips of the broken branches. So on the texture side, I think that's everything I changed. So we can go back into SpeedTree and see the changes I did on the mesh. The main changes I did was adding a directional force, and this one is really simple. I'm just using it to change a little bit the direction of my tree. I did this based on my references that I have. I wanted to add a little bit of a tilt towards the top and breaking it down a little bit in the middle. So this is a very small touch, but I think it works. Then I also added the tiny broken branches that I mentioned. And as you can see, I applied them a bit everywhere in those mid branches. I didn't add them on the top ones because it doesn't make sense to me, since those are very hidden, so you would barely see them from where the player would be. And then more importantly, I added them to the small broken branches down here, so both the big ones and the small ones have some tiny broken branches on them. And I feel this is a good one that adds some interesting silhouettes on the mid distance, as you can see. Besides that, I also added some displacement to the trunk. You can do that in the displacement tab. And I also added a flare towards the bottom, which makes it a bit thicker closer to the roots. This is quite common in trees. Some have it a bit more than the others. This kind of tree is actually pretty straight, but they still have a little bit So I added that since it also helps the blending with the terrain feel more natural. If you are doing this in other software packages like Blender, 3ds Max, Maya, or any other packages, you might have to approach things slightly different on the technical side of it. So while in SpeedTree you are using a node-based system or node-based workflow, in a common modeling package you will probably have to be using splines for the branches, or for example building pre-made branches with the leaf cards already attached to them and then attach those to the trunk, and essentially find a more modular way to work faster. Because, of course, placing everything by hand, card by card, is a bit insane and can be very time consuming, and I wouldn't recommend that. Try to find workflows that are more modular, where you can break things up, reuse stuff, and iterate more easily. But essentially, the main idea is the same. You should be focusing on the main shapes and the silhouette and making sure everything is looking as you want it to look before moving forward. I also like to come into this color mode because it is a bit less distracting, and here I can take a look at the main shapes and at the color at the same time, even though the color is not super important at this stage because this is just a blockout. And I also love to take a look in this mode, which is the opacity mode. This one is really great to just focus on the shape. And of course, you want to be looking in every angle possible, making sure it works from all the angles. And as mentioned previously, don't make it too uneven. Make it interesting without making the main shape too obvious and identifiable. I like that we have some negative space here, for example, and a little bit here, so it is not too obvious if you place this tree in the terrain 100 times. If you want to have different versions of your tree to create a whole pack, so that you could have more variations, like 2 adult trees and then some younger ones, half of the size of them, and also some saplings and things like that, this is the stage where you want to do it, so that you can test your texture and make sure it covers all your future needs. Take into account the whole set you need to do to make sure you don't need to make changes to the texture later on. I know I will be doing some extra trees, but I am confident that this texture atlas will actually solve all the situations for those as well. By now, I'm good to go to the next step, which will essentially be exporting the tree into Unreal Engine 4. There we will double check the scale of the object, check that the details are working fine and that the silhouette is working fine, and so on. It is quite important that you keep checking your asset inside your final engine. You always want to check the asset in context inside your project because that will be the final place where it will be used. So if you are working in a game, for example, you want to see it in relation to the character of that game. Or if you already have other things in the biome, like grass, smaller bushes, and even other trees, you want to place them side by side and see if it works together. You want to see if it creates a nice shape structure by adding the new trees, or if you need to change them a little bit more. So let's go into File and then Export to Unreal Engine. Because we are using the version of SpeedTree for Unreal Engine 4, the only export option available will be this one specific to the engine. Just click Save, and now this is quite simple. You don't need to touch the scale. This is just a conversion from inches to meters that SpeedTree sets by itself when you are exporting. For the LODs, just select the highest only, because we don't need to worry about them yet. For the atlas, just select none if you don't need SpeedTree to redo your UVs. If you do one of the other options, it will essentially try to rearrange your UVs. You might want that or you might not, so it is up to you, but I never use it. Then skip texture save so that it doesn't save the textures again, because you already have them, so you don't need SpeedTree to do it for you. Now just hit OK, and that's it. Now let's jump into Unreal and check it in there. Now that we finished the first blockout in SpeedTree and we just exported the tree in the previous video, let's go inside Unreal and test it here for the first time. So I'm going to import the SpeedTree file into Unreal and just leave the settings as default. I'll go right away and drop my tree in this basic scene that I created with some basic lighting setup, so that we can check things a little bit better. The scale seems to be there, so nothing should be broken, which is good. Let's go into the asset itself and let's search for distance field options. Let's turn the two-sided distance fields, and I'll crank this up a little bit for now. I'll also check the generate distance fields option and apply the changes. While that is cooking in the back, let's go into the materials folder that I already created and let's check these very simple materials that I have. So it's just a simple color for the bark, and this is a material for the atlas, but we don't have the atlas texture yet, so let's import it into Unreal. There are some things that I want to change in the texture, and one of them is the compression settings. So sometimes I leave it as default, and other times I like to use BC7 if I want a little bit more quality from it, or if performance is not really my main problem. And then a really important one is the MIP map generation settings. Mainly in the texture where you have your alpha stored, you want to change the MIP map generation settings to a sharpen. I usually use sharpen 7 or more, so from 7 to 10, but you need to adjust it to what works best for your texture. And what this will essentially do is make sure that the texture at a distance is sharper and that it doesn't turn into a mush after a while. This is a huge one actually, so I'll just crank this one up to 10 for now, and if it looks a bit weird, I can come back here and change it to something lower. Now let's assign the texture on the material and apply the settings, and of course you need to apply the materials into the mesh. If I'm not mistaken, the middle one will be the trunk. For some reason Speed3 does it this way, and the other two are the leaf meshes. Even though they are the same material, because I am using both front and leaf cards, and because Speed3 is setting up my wind, it will process them like this. But later on, when we have the final model with everything set up, we can go in and delete one of them without breaking it. So don't worry, I'll show you that later on. Let's close this for now, and here is our model. It is looking like in Speed3, but in a better lighting environment. And everything seems to be looking quite fine. But now let's do an extra step where we can actually test how this mesh would be used. And to do that, let's create a static mesh foliage. We can call it SMF and then just copy the name of the file. Then we assign the tree here. And now if we go into the foliage tab, let's drop it here and let's change the radius and the density. Let's also change the scale so that we have some interesting variation, just like a normal forest. And that's actually what we want to simulate, a very basic forest environment, so that we can read the shapes better and understand how this tree will work in that environment. So really make sure that you test your asset in a context that is relevant to your project or for your needs. I'll just click once and you see it is already a dense patch of forest, which is exactly what I want to test. Now if we go into the scene like this, you see this way we can read what is going on a bit better. Let's try something that can be interesting, because right now it is completely blocking the light. So let's maybe try and crank the subsurface a little bit. Let's also multiply it by the color and see what we get. I don't think this will work very well, but let's give it a try. Okay, so this way we can have a better look at the trees, see if they work in a forest environment or not, check the shapes and make sure that they are working in every angle possible. Make sure you are checking them based on the project you are creating, and if it is a game, for example, you want to test the trees from the perspective of where the player will see them. So if it is a third-person project like this scene, you will most likely be seeing them from below and from the sides, but you will not see them from above very often. So maybe focus more on that and just keep iterating until you get the results you feel comfortable with. Now that we are happy with our asset, we will move forward into the next step,